à tous, merci d'être.
Welcome to everybody. Thank you for being here, either remotely or on site, to follow this conference on SMEs and on the single market. It's part of the French presidency of the Council of the European Union, as you know. Throughout this day, we will be having a series of speakers who will be addressing the strengths and weaknesses of the single market. We'll also be talking about the position of SMEs in Europe, and particularly underscoring how we can promote their development. And to kick the conference off, I'm going to ask Thomas Korb and Hubert Gams to come up here on the podium. Please be seated. Mr. Korb, you are Director General of Enterprises, and you're going to be going back over what has been achieved under the French presidency of the Council of the European Union, and particularly the impact of the decisions that have been taken in favour of European SMEs. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed. I'm delighted to welcome you here today at this conference of the Ministry of the Economy, Finance and Industrial and Digital Sovereignty. This conference marks the end of the French presidency, 6 months of French presidency, and we focus a lot on competitiveness. I'm delighted to share the podium with the Commission, dear Hubert Gams. I'd like in the introduction to come back to the various decisions that have been taken under the French presidency, which will be having a major impact on the single market and SMEs. And at the level of digitalization, huge advances have been made with the 2030 digital agenda and the two regulations which will really structure the single market and harmonize this market in terms of rules that are applicable to digital platforms and will better protect SMEs in this digital market. With DMA in particular, we will henceforth have very powerful tools to ward off unfair practices by platforms, with 18 specific rules which will ban certain practices and which will mean that SMEs will have fairer framework for their transactions. Some of these are well known. It will henceforth be banned for the large platforms to prevent users to disinstall applications or to change application. The same for the DSA, the same spirit which will harmonize for the whole of Europe rules that protect users as applicable to digital platforms. We've put an end with this regulation to fragmentation of rules within the single market regarding platforms, and we hope that this will be a vector for development of SMEs in the digital field, thanks to this single framework. Apart from digitalization, other decisions have been taken that will greatly enhance the operations of SMEs, competition with one on foreign subsidies, which means that SMEs will have a fairer framework to work in as compared to foreign competitors on the single market. The adoption of the regulation on public procurement, which will give fairer access to these markets and open up public procurement both within Europe and abroad to European SMEs and give them a boost to their competitiveness. And the standardization regulation is significant in that it will protect everybody regarding products within the EU and also be used to promote European values outside Europe. These European values are also to be found in the objectives regarding companies' compliance with social and environmental standards, a very high level, with extra financial reporting and sectorial regulations such as one on batteries, which was adopted under the presidency. This means that ultimately an EV battery, these are very significant for the automobile market, will not be able to come onto the single market if it has too high CO2 footprint, because it will no longer meet our objectives in terms of restricting greenhouse gas emissions. This brings us to the Fit for 55 package as a whole. We have made major progress there, such as the carbon at border adjustment mechanism, which will help to avoid carbon leaks. This is obviously significant for industrial SMEs, and we're continuing discussions. The Czech presidency will also do so, make progress on the rest of the Fit for 55 package over the coming months. We're at a turning point also when it comes to European economic policy and the building of the single internal market, with a whole rethinking of this European model, which is necessary because of the health crisis and the war in Ukraine, both of which have shown that we are too dependent, the impact of such dependency, and therefore the need to strengthen our most critical value chains within Europe so that we have a more resilient internal market, which is also more integrated. The Versailles Summit on the 10th and 11th of March really set out the future course here. We have been asked to work on clear objectives and strategic sectors: energy, raw materials, digital, health, semiconductors, and agri-food, where we need to boost the resilience of European value chains. And here, what we see, and we've tried to show this throughout our presidency, is that industrial policy and strengthening the internal market really the two sides of the same coin, and there's no contradiction between them, contrary to what might have been thought in the past. Regarding strengthening of the internal market, efforts have been made within the frame of the European budget. 65 billion euros that have been earmarked for the funding of SMEs in various forms, and thus support the development of these enterprises on the internal market. We're continuing this effort with industrial policies, the important projects of common European interest, IPCEIs, which are a pillar to help us strengthen value chains, and which give great importance to SMEs at European level. For instance, the cloud IPCEI, which was pre-notified at the beginning of April, and which is intended to flank the upscaling of European enterprises which offer services on the cloud. With the IPCEI in France, there are 6 projects, and this is brick of innovation to the building of these technologies. Health IPCEI as well, which is also aiming to develop SMEs in this sector. 27% of the total budget there will be earmarked for the support of SMEs. And in some areas here, there will be European SMEs that will be in the lead of major IPCEI projects. So we're really foregrounding innovative capacities of SMEs. They can really take the lead on major industrial projects. SMEs need to grow as well in another strategic sector, electronics, with the CHIPS Fund, which has been much discussed under the regulation on semiconductors, the CHIPS Act. The CHIPS Fund, from our point of view, is a good response to a high capital intensity sector's ability to help startups, SMEs, intermediate size firms, and help them get access to financing so that they can ramp up. 550 million euros have been set aside for this purpose to give a boost to the momentum for funding of SMEs in this sector. And we're doing all of this at a time when energy prices are rising, input prices are rising. It hits SMEs hardest. These are the most vulnerable firms in the face of such difficulties. A number of responses have been identified to this. The framework drawn up by the Commission following the war in Ukraine to provide support to the energy intensive firms, many of which are SMEs, and other initiatives, for instance, between France and Spain, in order to have a better analysis and sharing of information about the specific impact of price hikes and supply disruptions on European SMEs, and to share good practices when trying to find solutions. Along the same lines, and in a very structuring way, have another initiative which is aimed to meet a challenge in terms of mobilizing financing for European startups for scale-up, so that these firms, to provide European funds to find key investment tickets for these startups, so that they can have access to significant volumes of investment and take risks. The first funds have been made available within the frame of the Scale-Up initiative as of February. And then, of course, a lot else remains to be done. I hope that I have shared some of the positive advances with you. A lot has been achieved at this level, but of course there's a lot that remains to be done if we are to build a digital market, particularly in terms of cybersecurity, to have a union of capital markets. We've been working on this for some time to improve the service sector and its functioning, improve tax and budgetary harmonization, social harmonization in Europe. A minimum wage, for instance, in Europe is a good example of this. So a lot of challenges that lie ahead that we need to deal with together. I'm delighted that we have this opportunity today to have an exchange of experience. We can listen to the various proposals that you will have to make so that we can all work to ensure that European SMEs can continue to work to develop on the European internal market. On the French side, I can confirm that we are determined to forge ahead. We're going to work very closely with the Czech presidency, with the European Commission, on all of the initiatives that will be continuing on sustainable products, artificial intelligence, or Fit for 55. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Thomas Korb. Perhaps you'd like to sit down, and Hubert Goms will be taking the floor. He's Deputy Director General at DG Grow. Mr. Goms, you were saying to me that you feel that Europeans' day-to-day life is closely related to how the single market works. Could you explain this to us? I would be delighted to. Dear Sandrine, Director General of Enterprises, dear Thomas, dear ambassadors and of SMEs, dear representatives of enterprises, thank you to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted that this event has been organized today. It combines a discussion of the single market and policies on SMEs, because these are two key cornerstones of our lives. Today, and here, we're at the heart of French activities in favor of the economy. France is a key player in Europe, and France has the presidency of the Council, so we're at the heart of policy action for the economy of Europe as a whole. The internal market is one of the cornerstones of our economic Europe. Its importance goes beyond that. Problems that were encountered at the beginning of the pandemic were a harsh awakening. They showed us all of a sudden that our daily lives depend very much on the single market, the internal market, working well. If it doesn't work smoothly, our industrial companies cannot have raw materials to produce their products, and very quickly we would run out of food to eat. How would we gain access to products that are so vital to our health, for instance? So, of course, the market is very important. Nobody could query this. But this is also true of the major players in this market, SMEs. Just try and imagine a world without SMEs. you probably still have a bed because, but maybe not because but perhaps you would because it may be a well-known Swedish brand, but maybe not because many of the suppliers of that well-known Swedish brand are SMEs. And what about on your breakfast table? No bread, no jam, no marmalade. And this is why SMEs are so important. It's often said they're the backbone of the economy, and this is very true. Or as Commissioner Thierry Breton says, they are the foundations of the economy, or Ursula von der Leyen says that we cannot do without SMEs. So SMEs are part and parcel of the ecosystem in Europe, in the strategy for the internal market presented by the Commission. And therefore, we need to do everything we can to ensure that the internal market works smoothly, not in a theoretical and abstract way, but in very concrete terms. We need to protect our SMEs. We need to create opportunities for them to develop and to foster their ideas and to provide jobs to millions and millions of people throughout Europe. And this is the context for today's presentation. I'd like to thank you, Thomas, and all your teams for everything that has been achieved over the last 6 months, for the internal market and for SMEs in particular. You've worked very hard. It's not over. There are still a few days ahead. You've already mentioned a number of initiatives that have been taken under your presidency, and I'd like to congratulate you warmly.
Let me just mention the harmonised charger, access to public procurement tender, something that has been blocked for years, legislation on digital services, and at a more political level, there's the Versailles Declaration. All of these initiatives have a real impact for SMEs. Now, your presidency will draw to a close in a couple of days' time. But let me reassure our friends in the Czech Republic. The French have done lots of work, but you still have plenty of work ahead of you. Don't worry about that. In order to defend the single market, we will need the market urgency instrument, perhaps better known as the single market emergency instrument. This is at full speed, and we're working together with we're going to work together with the Czech presidency in the months ahead on this. We've seen that the single market can be vulnerable, perhaps more than we imagined or expected, and certainly more than we should allow. We therefore need an instrument that will guarantee the good functioning of the single market and our own strategic independence. The European Union has set out the next generation EU recovery plan, but it's not just a recovery plan. It's a unique opportunity to transform our economies and create jobs in a Europe that we want to live. We have everything we need to succeed. But we do have to work to make Europe greener, more digitized, and more resilient. We need robust SMEs to do that, because when the crises come, it's the SMEs that offer resilience, and they show us that small doesn't mean weak. But to remain that resilient, we at Europe, national, regional and local levels all need to work to make sure that companies can be set up, to facilitate their path through the economy and to help them grow. Good SME policy is also good labour market policy, because SMEs create stable jobs for our citizens. So our job is to help SMEs to succeed in what they do. Thomas, staff of the French presidency here in Bercy, let me thank you for organising this conference. And let me thank you for the excellent work that your teams have done during the French presidency. Thank you for inviting me today. Thank you for coming today. And I would call on you to work towards promoting strong SMEs in a strong single market. Thank you very much, Hubert Gomp. Thank you, Thomas Korb, for your introduction to this SME and Single Market Conference. Please remain in your seats for the moment. Before we start the first round table, we're going to look at a video which outlines our dependence in term for raw materials and how we remedy that situation. In 2023, the single market will celebrate 30 years of life. The single market, or the common market, is a customs and economic union of the 27 member states of the EU, and it's the largest free trade area in the world. From 1951, the common market aims to bring together people and to promote the development of the economies. It has social values, common competition rules, and a ban on restricting trade. The area grows as new member states join the EU, and the GDP is larger, has grown by 8 or 9% more than it would have if the single market hadn't come into being. Today, the single market allows citizens to work in other countries, study, set up businesses, or retire. There are 448 million consumers in the single market, so it's a real opportunity for businesses to develop, particularly for SMEs. The single market promotes social and environmental values that benefit businesses and citizens. It protects consumers' health, and it protects consumers against fraud. For example, it makes it possible to use your mobile telephone abroad without extra charges. It protects European businesses against unfair practices and uncompetitive practices from countries outside the EU. And it makes up 99% of our economy, 2/3 of the private sector jobs, and 50% of the value added in the European Union economy. Specific rules apply in the EU, for example, dedicated finance programs, support for research and innovation, and helping companies in the digital and green transitions. There are rules against late payment, and there's a streamlining of administrative procedures. It also helps businesses export to the rest of the world and attract foreign investment. Common standards make trade safer, make innovation easier, and promote efficiency and effectiveness for SMEs in Europe. In the next few years, there are going to be some major challenges for the single market. The green and digital transitions in the EU, for example, and to make sure that we have autonomy in the strategic sectors of health, energy and raw materials. It's therefore essential that we support businesses' competitiveness, and particularly SMEs' competitiveness on a world stage that's ever more complex. We need to carry on making European standards high quality. We need to promote European values for health and the environment. We need to empower and protect consumers as part of the green transition. We need to standardize tax and social rules.
La première table ronde est donc consacrée.
The first round table then is about the single market and what it can do for SMEs. And with us I have Sandrine Gaudin, Didier Kinet, Véronique Willems and Romain Moulin. If you'd like to come up here, please.
Je vous en prie, installez-vous.
Please take a seat.
Alors, vous avez des petits micros, main.
So you have some microphones. Sandrine Gaudin, you are Secretary General for European Affairs, and you're the link between France and the European institutions. What do you see as the main areas for work if we want to help SMEs develop within the single market? Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. I think I would actually say something that perhaps doesn't tally entirely with the excellent presentation that we've just had. There's one thing that hasn't been said, and so that would perhaps be my answer to your question. There is one essential advantage in Europe for SMEs, and that is that we have this single currency area where we use the euro. When the single market and the Eurozone are the same, we'll have even more opportunities for business and SMEs. It will make their work easier because where you don't have to change money, the trade is easier. The Eurozone rules, therefore, is something that we have to work towards because it goes together with a deeper integration of the single market. Okay, so which areas do you think are priority areas to work on? Well, there are plenty of them. During the French presidency, as we heard from Thomas and Mr. Gombs from the Commission, a lot of work has been done on reinforcing the economic fabric of Europe to reinforce strategic autonomy on those strategic sectors following the shock that we got with the pandemic. Then I think there's the external aspect of the single market that could be reinforced. That means reciprocity in public procurement markets, access there too, for example. This is, some politicians have said, the end of Europe as a naive body. We need to continue with negotiations, I'm sure the trio colleagues will, on foreign subsidies coming into companies in Europe, because European companies and SMEs don't get the benefit of that. So we need a level playing field in competition. So this external aspect will continue to be worked on. This goes as well for production standards. European businesses have to stick to certain rules, and sometimes they're very strict rules when it comes to environmental restrictions or labour rules, for example. So we want to work on this area of mirror rules. That means that where we adopt a text to reinforce the single market, we'll also create a measure that can be applied to imported goods. We haven't started our work on this field with the exception of batteries. Thomas mentioned that. It's a very good example. But this is just the beginning of a huge area of work where we update a lot of regulations. And I hope that that's going to make these mirror measures possible. Again, it's the end of us being naive in Europe, if you like. It's the end of an imbalance between what we impose in the internal market, and these are good things, these are positive things. It shows that Europe has high social and environmental standards, that we have values that are tied to those. But then we have to put an end to the imbalance with external competition. So if you like, we're extending the external market externally. What I think is very promising, this is all very promising because it's going to give confidence to European businesses and SMEs who will be able to say, look, we've got this level playing field in Europe, but what should we do to be competitive against foreign businesses? When the foreign businesses have to submit to the same rules, then that's going to be a good thing for reviving the single market. So plenty of work ahead. Thank you very much, Sandrine. Let me turn now to Didier Canet. You're the Sme Envoy for Belgium. Perhaps you could tell us what the situation for Belgium SMEs is. How do they see the single market. Well, I don't want to repeat what's already been said about the single market. Let me just say something about the specifics. Just hang on a sec, I think there's a problem with your mic. Let's swap. Ah, yes, that's much better. I wanted to give you some specific examples and show you how the single market and the Commission can help SMEs in a country like mine, Belgium. So we have a new SME strategy which came out in March 2020. It's a strategy directed specifically at SMEs. And the thread running through it, and my work, because I'm also responsible for SME policy and the PF in Belgium, is to try and define SME policy. And what we've seen over the last couple of years is that the Commission has this scoreboard, the SME fact sheets that come out regularly, and we can compare member states and the different issues that are part of the strategy. In Belgium, I think there are three main points. First of all, digitization of SMEs. Apparently Belgium's above the European average there when it comes to use of e-commerce, for example, or using ICT tech specialists, for example. We're also pretty good when it comes to innovation compared to other member states, apparently. And we have relatively good access to financing through, for example, bank loans, but also venture capital. So those are the three big areas in Belgium. There are some areas where we need to improve. Apparently, we have a bit of a skills mismatch in the SMEs, and the cost of labour is quite high in Belgium. When it comes to payment times, we're a little bit over the average in Belgium. So as I say, there's room for improvement. One thing that was interesting to hear from the Commission was the access for SMEs to public procurement tenders. The good news is that we know there's a problem. In November 2021, the Belgian government approved an action plan with 32 measures aimed at stimulating SMEs and to help them access public procurement tenders. The SME strategy is part of the Recovery and Resilience Plan following the pandemic, but I've really made that the main guiding light for our policy in Belgium. We have about 1 million businesses in Belgium. That's an awful lot of jobs, and it makes up 99% of all businesses, which is the same statistic for the rest of Europe. 99% of European and Belgian companies are SMEs. So the value of a single market should be clear. I think they're clear with all of the measures that Europe takes. They can help economic growth. Anything done for economic growth helps SMEs because 99% of businesses are SMEs. Let me give you some examples. As part of the SME strategy, we're talking to SMEs a lot about digitization. We're also talking to them about looking to sustainable economies, so diversity, circular economies, and what have you. And these are the two major planks of the SME strategy, the twin transition. Now, we regularly assess SMEs' ability to access financing, whether there's fair competition in B2B. We haven't yet assessed Belgium implementation of the UTP directive in the agro-food sector, but we've got the proportionality and the professional qualifications directives that we implement, and we help SMEs with a single digital gateway, allowing SMEs a single point of access so that they can get the answers that they need about the single market. Belgium's quite complicated because we have federal, regional and local levels. All of the measures that I've talked about are taken in consultation with the regions and the municipalities, and they're part of networks that we run. That also helps inform SMEs of what's going on the ground. Let me just come back finally to the recovery plan. This post-COVID recovery plan is funded by the EU Commission. There are two big investment projects for SMEs in Belgium. One is the transition towards the circular economy, so awareness campaigns are being run. And we're also raising awareness about cyber security. So digitization and sustainability tie in there, the two big planks of the SME strategy. And we're calling on SMEs to propose projects to us. So as you can see, I'm very much behind this. I very much see the European project as being something that helps SMEs and should help SMEs. So this is absolutely fundamental. And we will certainly always do our utmost. The proposals that I put to our minister are always very much in line with what's going on at EU level, both in terms of the measures themselves and synchronizing the measures.
Thank you very much indeed. Romain Moulin, you are the Veronique Williams, you're the Secretary General of the SME United. I'd like to know how you think the SMEs actually see the single market and how they actually benefit from it. Yes, well, I was president as the Secretary General of an organization for SMEs, which brings together SMEs across Europe and even from outside Europe as well. We also have the UK and Norway and Ukraine and Turkey as members of our network. We discuss these matters a lot because all of these organizations have actually had requests from the SMEs in their countries. I just wanted to say that we should stress the importance of the heterogeneous nature of SMEs. We have SMEs across the sectors with different activities. We have some companies who work like Mr. Gams mentioned earlier. We have others that are involved in the digitalization field and that we see actually here. So it's a very heterogeneous landscape. And also, as far as the type and size of companies is concerned, it is very heterogeneous as well. Mr. Kine mentioned SMEs which have fewer than 10 employees. 93% of the SMEs have actually fewer than 10 employees, so it's a majority. These companies have also got different levels of ambition. Some companies want to grow. They want to actually become the leaders in the European Union in their field or in the world. They want to increase the number of their number of employees. There are others that actually have chosen to actually be active only in their own home market with a limited number of staff. So we must remember that the level of ambition for SMEs differs from one to another, and that they have the right to decide on whether they're going to be large players or smaller players. Of course, there are some which want to be active only at a local level, have a local clientele, and there are others who want to have a clientele right across the world. So this is something which we've got to actually understand and take on board, and that's also sometimes the reason why some SMEs do not want European European legislation to change, because for them that represents an additional cost. And they don't necessarily see the added value in it. Some want to see change, they welcome change, enabling them to go more easily to other markets and to other member states, as you said earlier. So this is something that we've got to take on board. And we've also got to look at another element, which is the capacity to absorb change. So SMEs have had to go through COVID. Now we're seeing the impact of the Ukraine crisis and the hike in primary raw materials and energy and the cost of labor as well. This is all going up day by day. The capacity of companies to actually manage all this is quite notable. So sometimes they might say, well, we can't actually take any more. When we've seen the impact of COVID and the Ukrainian crisis, we've seen that this has had a real impact on companies, and new regulations, new rules are coming out as well for SMEs, and this is all extra burden for the SMEs to manage. If I look at the challenges that lie ahead, I think the most important change for the single market is going to be the implementation on the or enforcement measures to ensure that rules are actually followed. I'm very pleased to see that the public procurement markets have been mentioned here as well, because when I talk to representatives from different member states, I think that everyone agrees that a lot more can be done to ensure that SMEs have better access to public procurement contracts within member states, and also beyond the European Union. Standardization as well. There's a lot to be done here. We have Small Business Standards, which is an organization which is aimed at ensuring that standards are also accessible for the SMEs. But here again, we see that there are many problems at international level, and even at European and national level, it's difficult for SMEs to be included in the standardization process. Also, mention was made of a level playing field, and that is a real challenge still at European level. So when I look at this, I think we have a problem of implementation of the rules, making sure that the rules that have actually been drafted are implemented in the fair and balanced way in all European countries. So that's really the message that I wanted to get across at this stage. Thank you. Let me now give the floor to Romain Moulin. I'd like to thank you, Veronique Williams, for your comments. Romain Moulin, can you just actually pick up on that very last point that was raised? Sorry, Sandrine Gaudin, could you come back to that last point? I wanted to talk about the importance of standardization, because that is indeed an area which is being worked on, but we need to actually step up our efforts on this. And I think we've also got to think about how we produce the standardization. We've got to make sure that we include the perspective of the smaller companies as well there, because they're involved in it. They're implicated in this. I mean, they've got to have a more of an active role in how these standardizations are actually conceived. So what I think has been stressed here today is the fact that there are many, many standards. There's a lot of regulation. That's, of course, quite normal, because the European Union establishes a framework for the single market and produces a lot of rules and standards. So you might have the impression that there are more and more rules coming through the pipeline, and it's very difficult for small structures to actually take all of this on board. But that's the way in which the European Union works. They create the conditions, the rules of the game, and then it's up to the companies to actually use these rules and these frameworks. The implementation, the importance of implementation is really clear, because when there is a lack in the implementation of the rules, then that's where the system breaks down. And that's where we could have a problem if we want to create some type of unified and integrated area within Europe. I think that there's going to be a discussion later on about how we can work to better ensure implementation of the rules or enforcement of the rules and ensure that SMEs do actually have an appeal structure through, for example, Solvit when there are questions that have been raised, so that there is a network which is completely free of charge, which is accessible to all and to SMEs in particular. So I think the importance of the implementation of the rules of the game is very important. And then if you look at the whole, this body of standards and rules, it's huge. We can talk about, we can look at fiscal rules, labor market rules, technical rules, all of the things that were mentioned earlier. We cannot today deal with all of the problems that have arisen, but I do understand this concern that you want to ensure that when the standardization is under discussion, when the standardization rules are under discussion, and my position is I'm one of the French representatives for at Europe, and when we're thinking about developing a new standard which is going to apply to companies, in particular the smaller companies in Europe, as you said yourself, a majority of the companies working within Europe are SMEs. So we need to think about how we can be more effective and more efficient. Perhaps we should be deleting or throwing out some of the standards that already exist, as we're doing, to try and avoid over-regulation. Well, it'd be really interesting now to hear from the head of a company. We have Romain Moulin with us. We have Mr. Moulin from Exotech, who's working in the area of automation. I think that you have got a very strong position, but I think that you are concerned that the human resources rules are too limiting within the single market. Well, yes, I'm sorry, but I think you've actually stolen my thunder, because I just want to give you some context to what we do. We do develop automated robots which are used throughout the world in the USA, Canada, Japan, Europe. It's a company which employs some 400 people. We had about 100 million turnover last year, and we've increased this year. We actually, you might have heard of us at the beginning of the year because we were the 25th industrial unicorn, which is actually very, it's very important. We have listed at a value of 300 million on Goldman Sachs. But sometimes actually having this financing can actually be a problem for SMEs. I just mentioned that because it's a good thing. When you develop a robot or a product, you look to see what type of legislation is applicable in this area, and there are some wonderful things in Europe which are directives. We have the Machines Directive, and once your product is actually in conformity with that rule, then you can actually sell throughout Europe without any exceptions. And in fact, it's even better than that, because the directives are so well drafted and so forward-thinking that in many countries outside Europe will also accept your product. So that's a wonderful thing. Just as far as engineering is concerned, you know that when you want to go to a new country, you're not going to have to re-explain your machine and start to redesign your machine. So in France, we start out in France, and then we've spread out through to other countries. And I'm a great fan of the Machines Directive, and I would like to thank the EU for drafting that. As far as the sales of effectiveness is concerned, that's a really, really good tool. The second point I wanted to raise, which is a little bit more problematic, is it concerns the individuals. Now, if we wanted to sell simply software, then that would be easy. But we want to deploy a whole system, and there are 5 to 10 people who actually have to set up the machine, set up the robot over 3 or 4 months at this site, at the client site. And sometimes this is in different parts of Europe, but it can be anywhere in Europe. Our system is based on shelving, and the robots actually can go up through the shelves. And the best people to do that are the Polish. So we have a whole team of Polish workmen that we actually send out across Europe to actually install our machines. And I think that this is where we've seen the limits of the free movement of individuals, because each time we've gone into another country, we've had to very clearly look at the requirements of every member state for workers, for seconded workers. Sometimes we've had to actually send people to another country to actually employ people, because sometimes countries have different labor rules, and we've had some projects blocked because we weren't actually deemed to be in conformity with the legislation of the country. So there are sometimes obstacles that appear at national level, and sometimes things aren't very clear, because when we're working in countries where we do everything we can to be in conformity with the rules, sometimes we still find that there are obstacles. So even though it's going to cost us 500,000 €500,000 to open up an office in another country, we will do that because we need to have people who can actually work for us there. So you've got to be aware of this. To actually develop a project that can be sold everywhere, that's quite easy. But if you need to have resources in every country or develop resources in every country, that's a much more time-consuming exercise. I saw the video earlier on this morning that very much corresponded to our situation, because we have supervisors in every site where we make sure that people who can be present in every site, that they have all the paperwork in order, so that if there is a labour inspector, they can actually show the paperwork to the labour inspectorate. So this is all actually in need of some type of simplification, digitalisation perhaps, so that we're able to actually really have freedom of movement of workers across the EU. And of course, every country also has the minimum salary rules to make sure that seconded workers don't actually destroy the market. And that's also important. Something else which is important, I think, is hasn't been mentioned, is the issue concerning taxes and the administrative wherewithal, because we have got product conformity, but we need to when we actually try to get tax reimbursements from one country sent from one country to another, it can be quite a nightmare. But what solutions do you see? What would we have to do to try and facilitate this? I think we need to have greater harmonization so that every country has its own system. I understand this, but it should be centralized. It should be clear. There should be more digitalization. I think we need to see more processes based on, that we have too many processes which are based on national forms, and I think that could be centralized to make things a little bit more effective for a company like us, but also for SMEs in general. What is important is efficiency. If you actually have to employ someone to do all the paperwork, it's going to slow things down. It costs you money, and so I think if we had a platform of some sort, then we could actually create companies anywhere in Europe. We could actually hire people across Europe. So, can I just ask, Verlie, if you want to continue from what Romain Moulin has said? Yes, this sounds like the comments I've heard from other employers over a number of years. Yes, harmonisation, we need that, yes. On the other side of the coin, however, let me remind you that there are companies which are active at local level only. And therefore, I think we've also got to remember that there is great diversity within the EU. So on the one hand, companies do want to say greater harmonization, but on the other hand, they also want to actually have some respect for the specificity of their own local areas. So it's a balancing act. Digitalization, yes, I agree with you. I do remember when I was chargé d'affaires in Belgium I was looking at this single form for VAT, and I discussed these questions with member states from other member states, and they said, well, no, this is not possible because we have specific codes on our forms for each member state, and it's not possible for us to harmonize these forms. I understand what you say. I think this is an area that we should be looking at to see how we can digitalize this, how we can actually create some type of platform. We have also suggested that we develop a card for seconded workers so that they're able to go from one member state to another with this particular card. So I think that when we look at the progress that we're making in digitalization, that this is perhaps an area where investment can be made for all members of the European Union to see what is possible using perhaps blockchain technology, machine learning, I don't know what else. I'm not an expert in the field, but I think that there are many opportunities in this field. And of course, we shouldn't actually be putting all of carrying the nonsense over from paper forms into digital form. I think when there is difficult difficult systems that are based on paper. We can't just transport this into the digital world and think that we've resolved the problem. So I think, as you said, sometimes we've got to be able as well to and willing to delete some of the red tape. I was thinking about, it reminds me of a colleague that a friend of mine has said to try and change mindsets. If you buy a banana, he wanted to buy a ladder, and instead of and they put a so you want to change your mindset, and are you going to actually buy it? But if you want to prevent someone from slipping up, are you going to simply buy a banana, or are you going to prevent them from walking under a ladder? So I think we've got to really rethink the whole logic behind our SMEs.
Conscience de ce problème évoqué par Romain Moulin.
Are you aware of the problem that was mentioned by Romain Moulin? Do you think this is something that will change in the short term, or will it take some time? Everything related to social matters and labour law falls under the purview to a large extent of the national authorities, and so we are up against this problem, because when we try to harmonise, perhaps the term harmonise is not appropriate, it's perhaps a taboo, but when we try and better coordinate the national systems, it's very hard to make headway, because after all, this is the prerogative of the national authorities, their social security systems, social contributions, it's cultural, and it's the whole way they organise labour. So these are probably the most complex issues alongside tax issues, and I guess it's no coincidence that these are the ones that require rules of unanimity, unanimous voting, and not qualified voting. So we do want to make headway, obviously, in this area, but the pace is inevitably quite slow, because we come up against forms of prejudice regarding secondment of. During the pandemic, we discovered in France, when we closed our borders, all of us, very suddenly, with the lack of consultation owing to the crisis, that we no longer had access to manpower that we needed for some of our sectors, and that subcontracted workers, it was all a bit more complex than we imagined. In France, we tended to think that these were people who were invading the market and replacing our own workers. We realised that that wasn't as simple as that. We needed these people for shipyards, for factories, for building sites, nuclear power plants, so vital infrastructure for our economic activity to continue during the crisis. So we've changed our viewpoint on this. And the crisis, as so often is the case for crisis, has enabled us to revisit all of this. But our regulations on subcontracted labour is seen from the approach of fighting fraudulent practices. So that's the angle that's been adopted in all this legislation. It's quite clear in that respect. So these are workers who come from other countries. Over the last few years, it takes years, we've been trying to negotiate a regulation on the coordination of social security systems. It's important for cross-border workers, not just workers who are subcontracted and come to work in another country. And all of this takes years. There are two options, really. Just as under the French presidency on the minimum wage, you can tackle it head on, you can push hard and try and push to get European consensus. And on this particular subject, we were very determined. We perhaps were even quite aggressive in trying to force through the minimum wage, and we managed. That's one option. The other option is to change the framework, the treaties, in other words. It's a broader debate, so that this area, because it's closely interlinked with economic life and workers, so as to make sure that there's mobility of companies goes hand in hand with mobility of workers. Though we change the framework, we change the treaties so that decisions can be taken more quickly. That's another approach. It's a political choice towards more integration, but that's not something that's going to happen overnight. But in the case of the broad consultation of citizens on the future of Europe, the Conference on the Future of Europe, these social and labour-related issues crop up a lot, together with climate-related concerns. These are subjects that are often mentioned, and I'm hopeful, not overnight, obviously, because it's tough, but I'm hopeful. The other difficult area is fiscal practices, tax practices. It looks like just bureaucracy, but it's deeper than that, and it's related to national regulation. So each of us has to put our own house in order. It's not the fault of Europe, or not always. We have too much paperwork, too much bureaucracy at national level. We're aware of these problems. On the French side, the Europe of workers, the mobility of labour, is something that we've reconsidered. We've got a fresh look at this following on from our experience during the pandemic and the closing of the borders. It's positive, I think. Digitalisation is the right approach. Form A1 that you have to fill out when you want to send a worker to another member country will be completely digitalised. That may already be the case, but we need to go further than that. But as you say, we mustn't replicate the bureaucracy we have with paperwork and import it into the digital world. I don't have a simple answer. We do intend, I'm talking about France here, France does intend to push in favour of a social Europe. Romain Moulin. It is complicated, and thank you for confirming that. And there is a real issue behind this about the difference of social protection from one country to another, and it's only to be expected that each country will defend its own system. I was here to be a bit provocative, but I'm certainly not calling into question the outstanding work that has been done. I wouldn't have liked to have to open Exotec 40 years ago. Much has been simplified thanks to the European Union. Thank you, Romain Moulin. Véronique Willems, yes, just to come in 2 points here. As you said, it was the pandemic that opened our eyes when member countries suddenly overnight closed their borders. And it's then that we realised that there's so much more that needs to be done. It was hard for entrepreneurs who live in one member country, but they have their company in another one. There are colleagues in the room in this case that will confirm this. Many of them complained to us because they weren't able to benefit from support from either member country. So we need to sort this out, and I hope that this is being looked into and being solved at the moment. The second point relates to fighting fraud. What we've seen over the last few years is that European level rules and also national level rules often put in place as a catch-all rules where only a few people are cheating. So I think we need to take a look at this and see that it's good to prevent abuse, but you don't want to sanction, to penalise those who are acting in good faith and who want to do business, as you described, scale up their company and contribute to the economy. Thank you, Véronique Willems. You can ask questions to the panelists. We have allowed for questions and answers. I don't know if we have any questions. Pending that, I would like to turn to Didier Quinet. You talked about the crisis in Ukraine, which has completely changed the situation. What has it changed for Belgian firms, SMEs in particular? Well, generally, the crisis in Ukraine is a complete shake-up. It's affecting every member country, not just Belgium, obviously. Personally, I can talk about Belgium. all sectors are being hit by what's happening there. The shortage of raw materials, inflation, price volatility, that's affecting sectors across the board. But I'd like to give a concrete example, which is agri-food in Belgium. There's a shortage of sunflower oil. As you know, sunflower oil is used to make just about everything, chips in particular, so you can imagine that this is a major, major issue in Belgium. But on a more serious note, the government has really tackled this head on. It set up a specific task force to look for solutions. As I've said, there's a shortage of raw materials, but of course an increase in energy prices at the same time, increase in other commodity prices. If you can't get sunflower oil, you have to find some substitute. Fertilizers, their prices have increased as well. All of this has been taken on board by the Belgian government's task force, which encompasses 3 ministers. We're trying to find solutions, and the EU obviously can help find solutions. The agri-food sector is one of the 14 ecosystems that was presented by the Commissioner Breton. Hubert Gams mentioned this previously. It's been identified as a key sector. Another tool that we have within Europe is the SMET group, which aims to remove barriers to the smooth operation of the single market. It is not yet at cruising speed yet, but 99% of companies are SMEs. So let me remind you of that. So we need to be very focused on their needs. And then there's another new tool that's been set up by the Commission, the Sme Filter, which means that you can see whether specific measures are having a direct negative impact on SMEs. I'd also like to insist on the way in which the Commission has acted very flexibly, very agilely when it comes to temporary support, which means that some of our farmers who were really struggling got access to funding, and that's really important. So the Commission can be agile and flexible when this is necessary in a situation of crisis. It's worth underscoring that. Yes, if you could just wrap up, we've got a question. Yes, yes, of course. 2 further points. An idea that was expressed and implemented in strengthening of food supplies. Decisions have been taken by some member countries which are a little bit protectionist within the frame of this crisis, the banning of exports of foodstuffs. Mr. de Normandie from the Commission, immediately after the crisis, took measures to avoid that. Another initiative is to pool purchases at EU level when negotiating the purchasing of energy, for instance, energy supplies. You can hope to get lower prices. So these are all measures that are very important at European level. Now, there's a talk of uniformization, and I will conclude with this. With the Ukrainian crisis and the food sector, we had to look for substitutes, as I said, and this meant that manufacturers had a major labelling problem because they were obliged to change the labels. And this is a negative point because there the Commission gave a free rein to member countries, and each member country changed the labelling requirements as they saw fit. And we're in a rather awkward situation in terms of competition at the moment. It's generated disruptions. The consumers are very puzzled. They can't understand the labels, and their harmonization might have been a good thing. The tool that was mentioned, the emergency instrument for the single market, that's a very significant instrument which would help us to have, if there's a future crisis, to have a structure for shared approach by all member countries without everybody taking measures that don't fit with the other countries' measures. Thank you, Didier Quinet. I said that you had an opportunity to ask questions, and there is an address to do that, or a QR code otherwise, that you can scan. Question PFU, or you've got the QR code that you can scan with your phone. So we have a question. Sometimes we have the impression that there are lots of rules generated by Europe, but they're not always applied in the same way everywhere in Europe. This brings us back to what you're just saying, Didier Quinet. Sandrine Gaudin, would you like to address this one? I knew that I was going to have to address this question. Well, yes, the EU does generate a lot of rules because it's an international organization whose vocation it is to produce standards so that member countries can build something together in order to facilitate the putting in place of a shared economic space, movement of persons, capital, investments and the like. So that it makes sense. But the issue is, how do we produce these standards and whether the standards are applied? And that's Hubert's job. It's the job of the Commission. The Commission is the guardian of the treaties, of ensuring that European rules are applied properly by member countries. What I can say is that the procedures in place for this purpose really bite. I mean, they work. Before starting the session, I was chatting with Hubert. We have regular meetings with the Commission. There are lots of subjects where we maybe don't apply properly European standards in France, like other member countries. We're no better than anyone else. We're no worse. I think we're about average. Rules related to the internal market and environmental protection, for instance. And so regularly we sit down with the Commission and have an exchange about the difficulties we encounter in implementation. If they're not applied, it's not because we don't want to, because we've negotiated them, we agreed to them, and we've made sure that they are right for us in most cases. But sometimes it's simply hard to implement them in very concrete terms, constraints that we hadn't predicted, and we need to discuss this with the Commission. When we do discuss it, but we can't reach a solution, the Commission or another member country can attack us in the Court of Justice. We have a rule of law. The Commission, we produce standards. These are applied by the Commission and the Court of Justice. And sometimes we are told by the court that we have to apply the standards. So there are obligations to apply the rules and the standards, and we can be called to account. Just a quick reaction, Veronique Willems. Yes, very quickly, regarding the work done by the Commission in conjunction with member countries. It would be a good idea sometimes to include companies in these discussions to ensure that they can explain the experience of member countries, compare the member countries' experience and the company's experience and explain what difficulties they encounter. Thank you all very much indeed for the very good debate. Sandrine Gaudin, we're going to be talking about Solvit. It's an out-of-court dispute resolution tool, and Louise Breillet is going to come up here to talk to us about Solvit. Thank you very much indeed to our first panel.
Alors avec nous, Louise Breillet.
So we have Louise Breillet with us. She's head of the legal department at the French General Secretariat for European Affairs. So tell us about Solvit. Why is it so essential for the European member states? Well, I think it's essential for SMEs and citizens more than it is to the member states or their administrations. At the round table, you talked about a lot about implementation of union law. Now we're going to look at a specific lever, because there are others. Now, my apologies, I'm not quite sure how to make the slides work.
On va voir.
Sinon, on va devoir faire 100. On va faire sans. On peut faire sans, donc on va faire sans.
Alors, allez-y, on vous écoute.
Voilà. En quelques mots, en fait, Solvit, c'est un outil.
So, Solvit is a way of amicably settling disputes between individuals in different member states. Anybody can use it. It's free. We've heard that. And of course, that's important when you're a business, and particularly when you're an SME. The idea is that it settles disputes that citizens and businesses might encounter when there's a difference in law between two countries. So, for example, if I'm an SME, I want to go to Austria, I need a form, I can't get that from the Austrian authorities. Solvit can help me by creating a dialogue between France and Austria to get me the form that I need. So it's a facilitation of things, if you like. Solvit works across the single market, and that includes also the free trade areas, the EFTA countries, Liechtenstein, Norway, etc. Now, Liechtenstein's not somewhere that SMEs often think about, but it's part of the Solvit package. Now, as Solvit suggests, the idea is to solve problems. That's the rationale behind the network. Well, we haven't got the slides, but I'm sure we'll manage. Solvit is something that starts when citizens or SMEs can send a request to. They'll send a request to the centre, they'll explain the problem they have and what they want to get out of the process. And Solvit will try to arrive at a solution in 70 days, a bit more than 2 months. So it's a gateway. You send in a request, any sort of request that relates to the implementation of EU law. And I'll give you some examples in a minute, and it will overlap with what we heard on the panel a moment ago. So every country has a Solvit centre. There are 27 member states and 27 Solvit centres and 3 EFTA Solvit centres. On the slide, we've got the start of the problem, entering into the system, then exchanges between the Solvit centres, and then at the end, the solution that we try to arrive at for those who have called on Solvit for help. So the centres speak to one another to try and solve the problem. So you take the problem to Solvit tries to untie the knot and offer a solution. The service is also free. There's a one-stop shop for Solvit, and that's the Commission's website. You enter your issue there, and it's sent to the relevant Solvit centre. In France, we have an additional service because we also have a telephone line that you can call. And the previous slide actually has that number on it, if we could see that again. So if there's any concern about the problem, uncertainty or what have you, you can ring up the team and ask whether or not the problem can be solved by Solvit or not. Some companies, for example, will ask us to try and solve problems that we are not able to solve. But you can certainly start by talking to us. So there are 2 things that are good for citizens and businesses. First of all is that there's an amicable settlement to issues, but it's also that Solvit is impartial. Sometimes the cases that are sent to us by SMEs are indicative of a problem with national legislation. So if you like, we're something of a flagging systems, because we can signal issues that people might not have been aware of, a sort of diagnostic service. So we offer that to SMEs and citizens, but then we can also help the French authorities improve EU legislation by flagging up issues. We have a small team with Sandrine Godin, who works on this within the SGAE. So if you've got any questions, you can ask me or her, or I would hate to nominate her. Now, I don't have an example of an SME that I can give you, but there is Decathlon, the French sports store, that I can give you an example, and the issue of free movement of goods. You create a product, it meets the CE standard, and then once it has that certification, it should be able to sell it in different member states. Now, sometimes the CE certificate are checked given extra checks by other member states in their member states. So, for example, Decathlon came to us and said, look, we don't understand. I want to put this product on the market, but what's going on? So we talked to the Solvit Centre in the member state in question. We solved the problem. The Solvit Centre acknowledged that further checks shouldn't have been made, and Decathlon were able to bring their product to market. So that's one success story, and I hope that there'll be more when you send us your ideas. Secondment of workers is another issue where Solvit can help out. We have to coordinate social security systems. Cross-border workers, for example, what system will they subscribe to? If you can't get the famous A1 form, the digitization, then Solvit can help you do that. So you can come to Solvit via the address that I put on the slide. I can see it. Let's say it's the Commission's fault, shall we? Because Solvit comes to you through the Commission's website. There are a number of stages. You answer the questions, and there's a series of elementary questions which will show you whether or not Solvit can answer your question or not. And when you've been through that system, the Commission will send it to the right Solvit Centre. Whatever problems you have, as I say, Solvit France has a telephone number. Now, please don't try and ring the team this morning because they're following the conference with you. Just a question. How many people came to you last year at European level? I don't have a European figure, but we had 700 in France. And that's 700 that we really had a remit for and that we processed. And in 9 out of 10 of those cases, we came up with a solution. When you don't have a solution, as you're saying, the other member state is right. Thank you very much, Luis Brehe. I hope you've understood Solvit now, ladies and gentlemen. You can find more information on the Commission's website, as Louisa said. Let's now move on and look at the Brussels effect in the world. Does it really exist? Anu Branford is going to answer that question for us.
Donc, Anu Bradford est professeur de droit à la Columbia.
Anu Bradford is a law professor at the Columbia Law School.
La vidéo est lancée, donc je vais quand même la présenter. Si on peut remettre le magnéto.
I would just like to introduce Anu Bradford, if we could rewind the video to the beginning, please. Anu Bradford is a professor of law at Columbia Law School, an expert in international law. And she's going to talk about the EU's influence around the world. She recorded the video a couple of days ago. Let's listen to what she has to say.
Good morning, good afternoon, Paris, and greetings from the Columbia campus in New York City. I am delighted to be joining you today for a conversation about European power and influence, a power that is rooted in the European single market. So I'll be talking about the Brussels effect, which is based on my book, The Brussels Effect: How the European Union Rules the World. So the premise behind the book is to contest this common narrative of Europe's weakness, the idea that Europe would be a declining power whose best days are over. Because that is not the European Union that I encounter daily in my research and in my teaching. That Europe is actually very powerful and very influential, and that influence is felt all around the world. So let me give you a few examples of that European power. If we think about some of the biggest tech companies on the west coast of the United States, companies like Meta or Google or Microsoft or Apple, these companies use the European privacy law, the GDPR, the data protection regulation, as their global privacy policy. And then if we stay within this tech industry, companies like, again, Google's YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, they use the European definition of hate speech when they decide what kind of content they take down from their platforms. And it is not just American companies and the tech industry that feels the effects of European law. The EU regulations also determine how timber is harvested in Indonesia, what kind of pesticides African farmers use on their farms, what kind of facilities are installed in Chinese dairy factories, or what kind of chemicals Japanese toy manufacturers use when manufacturing those toys. These are all examples of what I call the Brussels effect. So the Brussels effect refers to the European Union's unilateral ability to regulate the global marketplace. The EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world. And there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European single market, these companies follow European regulations. But interestingly, often it is in their business interest to extend those European regulations to cover their global conduct or their global production, because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So by complying with the highest standard, which often is the European standard, these companies are able to have uniform production and yet operate across the world. And interestingly, all the EU needs to do is to regulate the single market. It can then sit back and let the companies' business interests to do the work. It's the markets that are transposing the European regulations across the world. So why do we talk about the Brussels effect and not, for instance, Washington effect or the Beijing effect? The EU is not the only large market in the world. Yes, you do need to have a large market. If you are, let's say, Costa Rica, and you decide to be the jurisdiction to resolve climate change, you can have very stringent environmental regulations. But global companies, if they find those regulations too costly, they just decide not to trade in Costa Rica. But it is very hard for them to do this with respect to the EU. But again, we have other large markets, including China and including the United States. But it is not enough that you have a large market. You also need to have the regulatory capacity, the legal institutions that allow you to unleash the power of that large market and convert it into tangible regulatory influence. And there's tremendous bureaucratic capacity in the European Union, less so in China, even though China is busy trying to build that capacity. In the United States, there's plenty of regulatory capacity in Washington, D.C., but most often that regulatory capacity there sits idle because there has not been political will to deploy it. And that then sets the European Union apart from the United States. There has been a consensus across different parties in the EU that environment needs to be protected, that digital economy needs to be regulated. And that is one of the reasons why the Europeans are taking the lead to generate the regulations that are shaping the global marketplace. And it is really the kind of power that matters, the power that is vested in the regulations defining the single market. It affects everyday lives of people around the world. It affects the food we eat, the air we breathe, the products we produce and consume. And to me, that is power, and that is source of relevance. And why is it also helpful for the Europeans to shape the world by regulating the single market? So first of all, you cannot resolve all the problems of the world simply by generating rules for Europe. Climate change is one of those domains that it helps the Europeans if the European regulations in the environmental domain make their way across the world. The other concern is that regulations are sometimes costly, and they can be an impediment to the competitiveness of European firms if only European firms are complying with those costly regulations. But with the Brussels effect, when those regulations are followed by companies around the world, the European companies don't take the hit when they are operating in the Chinese market, across Latin America, across Africa, or North America. So in that sense, it is also a tremendous benefit for the Europeans to be able to promote the values that are reflected in those regulations, and at the same time, make sure that the European companies remain competitive. Let me say now a few words, which is my call for action and maybe a word of warning for where we are today and where I see that we are heading. I think Europeans need to understand that the single market is the greatest source of the European strength, but we can't take it for granted. We need to preserve and further strengthen that single market. And my fear is that Europeans may be either underplaying their hand or overplaying their hand. What I mean by underplaying the hand is that we have failed to complete the single market in certain domains, including in digital economy. The fragmented digital single market is one of the main explanations why the big tech companies emanate from the United States and not Europe. If we had a full capital markets union, if we had an integrated digital single market, the European companies would be in a much stronger position. We may also be underplaying the strength that we have by not enforcing the ambitious rules that we have for the digital single market and the single market more broadly. So there are lots of questions of whether the Europeans are actually enforcing prominent rules like the GDPR, or whether the under-enforcement actually in practice fails to transform the marketplace. Overplaying the hand would, in my view, entail, for instance, that we are trying to geopoliticize the single market and the Brussels effect. And I am particularly worried about the shift in the recent conversation to harness regulations like the European competition policy towards industrial policy and convert some of our key legislations towards protectionism. That will not serve the interest of Europe. And the Europeans should also keep in mind that the Brussels effect is an effective tool to export good and bad regulations alike. And if the Europeans start enacting and enforcing protectionist regulations, the rest of the world will follow. And that is not the world that the Europeans want to have. So my call for action is that we remember to continue to stay committed to open single market that advances the values that are key to the European Union and the vision that we have for Europe and for the entire world. And we continue to further strengthen it and channel our ambition to that single market, because it is our greatest asset. And we need to all work tirelessly that it continues to remain so. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful summer. Thank you.
Alors, la deuxième table ronde.
So the second roundtable is now going to look at regulation and practice in the EU. Is this an obstacle or an opportunity for the development of SMEs in the single market? To answer this question, we have Francesco Martucci, Uti Slotboom, Armgard Wippler, and Juho Mäkinen-May, and Arnold Heinrich.
Alors, Francesco
Martucci, you're a professor of public law at University Paris 2, Panthéon-Assas, and you're going to look at the issue of barriers. But You say that this idea is either too broad or too narrow, depending on the sector. Tell us about that, please.
Et normalement, ça fonctionne.
Bonjour et merci pour l'invitation.
Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. So an obstacle, this is a legal notion which enables us to cover what we call barriers, trade obstacles, trade barriers. And this is a notion which actually has helped SMEs to create the internal market. Now, in what way? Because the treaty actually foresees that the single market is going to be a market without any barriers, where goods, services, capital, and individual can actually move quite freely. Now, within that, there is also an item in the treaty which talks about their rights, and any company can actually use the treaty to actually contest any national measures which could actually create a barrier to trade. The Court of Justice, in a opinion going back to 1994, which was about importing whiskey from the UK to Belgium via France, which wasn't, of course, UK in the day was a member state, saying that any type of barrier, a trade barrier, which actually prevents trade within the EU, in the single market, is actually going to be a barrier. So any regulation could actually be contested, and the strength of this jurisprudence meant that we were able to see where there was discriminatory measures, but also measures which were not applied uniformly across the board. So if you have a measure which is really used more in one particular area, this can be taken to a court and can be actually claimed to be discriminatory. So this can be this is a common case which is taken to the Court of Justice. Very often these barriers can be said to be justified because there is a common good or common interest. But the court will also be looking at how we can protect consumers, the environment, public health. These can be reasons to justify measures which could be deemed barriers to trade. Now, from there is also thought given to harmonization. We, of course, need to have a harmonization of case law. We need to make sure that the European legislation, the European case law, is harmonized. We can ask ourselves whether or not this is useful today, whether there's perhaps need for special legislation governing small and medium-sized companies. And something else which I thought was of interest to continue the thought of the discussion in the first roundtable this morning is the idea that perhaps we have actually been a little bit too naive in the single market. The fact that we actually looked at this very much as a free trade situation, because we've got to also understand the need to identify whether the product coming from a third country is coming from a third country. It's actually equated to a European product, and so the mirror clause is very interesting here. Also, services. If you look at the European Union, if we want to open our markets, and this is a problem which was raised by Brexit, all the more so because of the free flow of capital. So harmonization, I think, needs to be pushed even further to ensure that we have legislation which is perhaps more thought out and properly tailored to the services and goods coming from third countries as well. Thank you, Marco Martucci. Let me now turn to Uti Slotboom. Let me remind everyone that you are the Director of Strategy and Economic Analysis at DG Grow. You have a microphone, I believe. Does it work? Yeah. Now, we've talked about these rules and the need for harmonization, but as far as you're concerned, our economy cannot work without rules, but with too many rules, it could also be an obstacle. It could stop the working of the market. So we have to find the right balance.
Good morning. Thank you for the question. Indeed, the title of this roundtable is Let's Compare Cultural Practices and Legal Rules, and what is the role of each of them. And I wanted to start from the facts and again go back to what Veronique Willems said in the earlier roundtable. There are small businesses which have a local vocation, which have a business model which consists of acting locally. And these are the large majority of small businesses. But then those businesses which export, which want to establish themselves also outside their home country, there we very clearly see a difference between the internal market, which really constitutes a home market, and the rest. Of those small businesses in the EU which have any export activities, 80% export to another EU country. Not outside, but inside the single market. 70% of the value of all the EU SMEs exports goes to another EU country. And this very clearly shows that it is the rules which matter. It is our single market which matters, which helps us create opportunities for small businesses to grow. We have looked at the reasons why SMEs would not act outside their home countries. We published a report on barriers to the single market in 2020. And if I can group the barriers and obstacles which SMEs saw into three groups. The first group would be issues which all businesses encounter inside their home country, but also outside. It is very basic things like lack of access to finance, lack of the necessary skills for their operations. The second group of obstacles is what is different outside your home country. It can be things which one could call cultural, like another language. A lot of small business owners do not see themselves and their companies operate in another language area. This comes out very clearly from our studies. But it is also national rules, not harmonized single EU rules, but rules which are different in every member state and every third country. Their tax administration, but also many other rules. Social protection was mentioned in the first round table. These very much come to play. And then we have the third group of issues which are a bit the bread and butter of the work of the Commission, which is about enforcement of the rules which we have in the single market. And again, this morning already many speakers have mentioned the fact that we have rules, but they are not applied in the correct way or in the right harmonized way. For example, many SMEs are struggling with difficulties to access public procurement in other EU countries, despite the fact that we have common rules which should guarantee them access. So what I'm trying to say is that it is important to have the single market. The rules clearly matter. What the EU does to help is a lot of things, starting from the creation of unified rules instead of a system of 27 national rules. Also the creation of standards. We just heard the presentation of Professor Bradford on how powerful European standards can be and how they can influence the global actions of companies. Secondly, enforcement. We have Solvit, we have enforcement task force. The Commission is actively launching infringements when the rules are not applied. We have help and advice actions. We have the Enterprise Europe network, which can give advice to any SMEs wanting to expand. And finally, we have money. In the new generation EU budget, there are significant funds available for SMEs. We have estimated that about 1/4 of the Recovery and Resilience Plan funds benefit SMEs, which is a huge amount. And one of the focal areas is digitalization. And I'm saying this in the context of the single market because for many small businesses, selling online inside the EU through a deeper digitalization is a very important way of expanding their markets. SMEs operating inside the EU can generate huge gains for our economy. There is more choice of products for consumers. There are national tastes, yes, but also there is demand for variety. Specialized SMEs can see their markets expand when they export. We will increase competition, we will see more innovation, and we will see more economic welfare. Thank you.
Thank you. Armgard Wippler, directrice générale.
Thank you. Armgard Wippler, Deputy Director General in charge of SMEs for the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action in Germany. Now, do you think that the single market is a success story? Do we have to develop it so that it is better adapted to the new challenges? Thank you very much.
Kindly ask you to put on the headphones. Der Binnenmarkt ist ganz sicher.
So the single market is indeed a success story. I think that that is without question. And despite that, we are actually in a situation where we need to develop it further. We want to develop further, and we want to make sure that it can meet the present challenges. However, I would like to just add that if you look at the political and economic situation in Europe right now, with the Russian invasion in the Ukraine, we can see that Europe has never been more important than it is today, and I think that we can see how important this is from the interest that Eastern European countries are showing for the EU. I think this is a good time for us to be thinking about the further development of the single market. Under the French presidency, we have actually seen a discussion paper for today's event where they have actually raised a number of very important questions. And to respond to these questions, I would like to actually turn to the watchword of the European Union, which is united in diversity, because we are a group of 27 sovereign member states. We live within Europe, and we show our strength in our diversity and the diversity of our countries. And I think that this is something which our leaders are going to have to also develop in regional and local, regional and national decision-making. I think that this is when we see the development of the services industry, for example, in Europe, this is something which must be kept in mind. This does not mean that we should be satisfied or that we can be satisfied with what we've achieved, because in particular in the services market, we can see that there still are many hurdles, many obstacles that we need to take down. The question is, how can we do this? There are three keywords here, which are sector-specific, targeted, and transparent. We have got to ensure that the individual areas of the single market can be studied to see where the obstacles are that we would need to take down, and how can we facilitate our daily lives, and where we can't actually harmonize and where we do need to act. It's in those areas that we need to ensure that there is greater transparency, so that national legislation is better known and more accessible. We need to be multilingual, we need to be digital, and in particular we need to make sure that we have a very clear offer of services. I also wanted to say that I would like to say that I'm really very much would like to thank Mr. Moulin from earlier on, from the earlier discussion, because he touched on the issue of posted workers. In Germany, what is the real, if I look at the real obstacle that we have in the single market, it really is the overarching bureaucracy for posted workers. Now, we have the principle of the same salary for same work in the same place, and this is very much a key principle for the acceptance of the single market by our citizens. But 27 different systems, 27 different demands or sets of requirements. This actually might be okay for the larger companies, but not for the smaller ones. It's very, very difficult when you look at this from a company perspective. I'm very pleased that this subject has actually been addressed at different levels. At European level, for example, with the e-declaration work to have an EU-wide portal for applications, which would come alongside the national systems, and I think that this is something which we can welcome from the German perspective. However, I would also like to say that we're doing a lot also at member state level. France and Germany work very well together in a committee for cross-border cooperation. I think that we can see how we are able to work together and alleviate regulations on both sides of the border. There's thought being given to the companies which are actually active in at the border region and who actually have a lot of posted workers amongst the two countries and who have up to date been compliant with the legislation, that they would actually be exempt from registration for formalities for a certain amount of time. So I would like to thank the French authorities for their cooperation in this project. I think that this is a very good example of how we can talk about harmonization of rules to alleviate the pressure upon the workers. Thank you. Thank you, Irmgard Wippler. I'd like to now turn to you, Juho Romakaniemi. You are CEO of the Finland Chamber of Commerce, chair of the Euro Chamber's Single Market Committee. Now, 30 years after the introduction of the single market, there have been a number of obstacles that we have been able to overcome. Does that make cross-border trade easier for the companies within Europe, and in particular for SMEs?
Thank you so much for the question. We have to first realize that the single market is something that is never ready. As Anu Bradford there presented us, there are always new areas that you need to create the common rule base. For example, we didn't have data rules or AI regulation in the 80s or 90s, 20 years, 30 years ago, because the technology was not ripe enough. Now it's something that we need to have a clear platform of regulation here in Europe. The benefits are quite clear, as the presentation earlier on, the video showed that it's estimated that the European GDP is 8 to 9% bigger today because of the single market. But the benefits are still there. We are not ready yet. The European Commission has actually estimated that by removing the existing barriers for goods and services inside inside the single market, it could boost additional 713 billion euros annually, the GDP. And to put that into a context, it's exactly the same sum that the next generation EU will move new funds to the European economy, and that would be annually. So it's kind of a low-hanging fruit and no-brainer to go forward with removing the obstacles for trade and services. Of course, the companies in the single users, the SMEs, are the end users of the single market, and we are doing this for the benefit of the citizens in the end of the day. So we need to ask the companies how do they see the single market and what are the greatest obstacles and how they see the solutions. And we actually conducted in the Euro Chambers the European-wide survey just before the beginning of this Commission's mandate, and more than 1,100 companies responded to our survey. And we got some, easily expected answers, but it reinforces also our message here. The SMEs particularly are keen on having new information concerning necessary procedures and formalities to operate in another EU country. The Commission has done really good work on this area, and the single digital gateway is a very good example of that. But this should be ongoing work as well, because the companies still feel it, that it's a problem, so we haven't solved it yet. About the solutions, how to push forward and what kind of problems there needs to be solved. The far most popular answer of all the companies, 91.2% of the companies say that there's too much red tape, extensive reporting, information or documentation obligation. That kind of an administrative burden that is killing business in the long term. I would also like to refer Anu Bradford's excellent intervention here. I know Anu from 20 years back when he used to work in the European Parliament in Brussels, and she's a really renowned global expert on the legal frameworks. And I haven't used the Brussels effect myself, but if the European Union is a trade superpower globally, we are the lifestyle superpower as well. We are also the regulatory superpower, as Anu previously said. And we need to understand what that means in the end of the day, because there are different kind of perspectives for the single market regulation. It's not only, interoperability between the member states and countries. We can see that it has a huge effect on the global legislative framework and conditions for trade as well. I go a bit further from what Anu said. Those, for example, for the GDPR and our privacy legislations, it's amazing that those American companies, guided mostly by the contractual agreements and private law, they use European legislation when they conduct business in Japan. And that's an example how our regulatory superpower role is seen on global level. But we need to be wise, because if we over-regulate, if we don't do smart regulation here on the single market, it won't be applied. And then we don't have that advantage that our companies have already adapted to that kind of an environment. Another example that it's not only trade between the member states in the EU. Of course, this goes beyond the EU with EFTA member states and several other jurisdictions that apply the single market legislation. It is also something that our companies, SMEs, need to adapt to when they conduct business in their home countries. No trade between the barriers and to other EU member states. You have to adapt to the EU legislation as well. We must remember those companies as well. So when Anu was referring to under-regulating or over-regulating, my advice, I've been working in the Commission as well, but for the DG Grow and all the regulatory experts, is that they think of when underdoing things, think of how can we set standards that are applied in Japan by the American companies, and when we are about to over-regulate, think of that SME trying to do business in its home country. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Juho Makaniemi.
Thank you very much indeed, Juho. We're now going to hear the voice of an entrepreneur, Arno Herrings, who founded Posidonia. Posidonia is a company that is specialized in naturally low sodium salt. Could you explain your involvement in the single market? Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. Let me explain Posidonia a little bit. It's a Belgian company. It has a production site in Spain, so we're a European firm above all. And the single market is for us a single market, truly. We work in 15 countries in Europe. We export to the US and Canada also. What do? Our ambition is to save 1 million lives a year. because give you an idea about salt, according to the WHO, 2.5 million people die every year because they consume too much salt. All of us in the room eat too much salt, 10 grams a day on average. The recommendations are 5 maximum. 80% comes from industrial food, processed food. So we're producing a naturally low sodium salt, which we sell to retailers in Europe and the US and also manufacturers, and this means that we can keep down sodium levels and protect people's lives. As the CEO of Exotec said, we're proud of being European. We've done an awful lot in terms of development in Europe, and this helps us with procedures, VAT, getting new clients, transport. It works very well. We can hire people who are German, Finnish, Spanish, French. That works pretty well. And also food claims. There's EU regulation on this that is applied in all countries. So, for instance, if you put a claim on the packaging minus 25% less salt or sugar, that applies throughout Europe, and it's a good sales argument for us, and it applies throughout the EU. We also have taken part in EUC Accelerator. This is a program that supports innovations within companies. We have been through the various rounds. We're at the last round now, and this was important for us because it really is a boost for innovation within companies. What's a bit more difficult for us to cope with? Well, there are a number of things. There's no shared vision when it comes to health. I know that health is not one of the EU's competences, but we think that it'd be good to have more of a shared vision on this. Each country goes its own way, adopts various measures separately in terms of regulation regarding salt. France has its own measures. Portugal has made headway, but many countries are lagging behind. The WHO has said that salt consumed should be reduced by 30% all over the world by 2025. And it would be a good thing if the EU could get into this also and apply a clear ruling. Labelling, we're agri-food in a way. Spain recognizes our product as being salt. And because of mutual recognition, all EU countries should also recognize our product as salt. But what we see is that whenever we go to a new country to bring out our product that's an ingredient, we have to go knocking on doors to get approval from the national authorities. Can we be considered as salt, or are we an additive? Are we a saline solution? Most countries should simply be able to work through mutual recognition. It shouldn't be necessary, but the Spanish decision isn't applied across the board. It should be, because it's the producer country that can decide on the claims on the packaging. Yes, Auti Slotboom, would you like to respond to what Arnold has just said?
It was really interesting to hear about the experiences you have had and the difficulties. You also mentioned that many issues you are dealing with are relating to health issues which are not necessarily regulated by EU law, but which are national competence, which brings us to the area where what the Commission can do is very much soft law. We have other informal instruments like the Single Market Enforcement Task Force, where companies can take up difficulties they have anywhere in the EU in dealing with national authorities. I have a lot of admiration for your drive in taking forward the product that you are selling and in coming here to take up this example. And it seems that you have found solutions. It seems that you are still struggling with a lot of things, and these are, of course, work for all of us. And I would encourage you to raise the issues also in the future to see if we can find more concrete solutions.
Auti Slotboom, une petite question sur...
Yes, a question about Solvit. Could Solvit solve this kind of problem that Arnold Herranx has mentioned regarding labelling?
Yes, Solvit, you already heard the presentation. Solvit is for issues where you are not in a legal dispute and you are dealing with a member state authority and you are looking for an informal solution. So this could indeed be a solution for you to look into.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Amgard Whipler. You have said you'd like a sector-based approach for best practice, in particular for subsequent development of a single market of services. What do you mean exactly by that? I'd like to give two examples to illustrate that. One has been addressed several times, and that's standardization for company services. There are 5 model projects. They're very sector-specific, and the idea is to see whether we could move towards greater harmonization. The second example I'd like to mention, a word that hasn't been mentioned so far, this is short-term leasing. We have proposed legislation that's coming up by the EU Commission for the autumn. This is a good example. It shows it's important to be active. In European tourism, this is really important. A lot of tourist accommodation is short-time rentals, and the tendency is increasing all the time. And there are various regulations throughout Europe. Sometimes you have regional rules about how many tourists can be in a given neighborhood or place. And then we have cross-border platforms. They can cope with this very well. But if you have smaller rental suppliers trying to set up business, they don't have the necessary resources to get onto the market because it's so complex. And therefore, we very much welcome the activities of the European Commission that's striving for more transparency, to really create a level playing field for the bigger and the smaller players. And we really support this. Thank you. Yes, Auti Slotboom, did you want to come in on this?
Indeed, in the tourism sector, we see a lot of examples where we have European tourists from outside the EU traveling, and short-term rentals are an issue for many of them. So in addition to the dimension which was mentioned on helping small businesses when there are platforms dominated or more easily accessible by large ones, we are also talking about a sector where we have tourists moving across the EU. So this is, for me, a very good example of where EU action, as you just said, can help, and we hope that we find a good solution once the proposal is agreed. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Juho Roka Kamenini, you said that SMEs suffered a lot during the pandemic. Now we have the war in Ukraine, which is exerting pressure on the economy as well. So what can political decision makers do to make life easier for SMEs?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. In the beginning of the pandemic, very rapid response action around Europe in very different levels and uncoordinated was the problem for the companies. And many businesses were shut and they suffered quite a lot. We need to be ready for the next crisis. Like we see the war in Ukraine, the Commission and the single market was a bit more prepared and ready, I should say, but the work needs to continue. But let's not overdo it, as the Commission is at the moment contemplating the proposal for the single market emergency instrument, for example. Let's not overdo it. Let's try to do as soft touch legislation that is possible. Let's use information first, then coordination, and then, imposing the regulations in the last phase. And I think that in this kind of an situation, when we build the market more resilient, we should have some sort of an consultative boards as well. If the Commission is willing on hearing the more structurally the SMEs and then the companies information for that kind of a regulation, the Eurochamber is always ready. We have 16 million businesses, conducting their business in the single market, and we actually are very keen on doing that kind of a cooperation with the Commission and the Member States.
Francesco Martucci.
Francesco Martucci, I'm turning to you now. Arnold Herings has said that there are hurdles which slow down the growth of SMEs, labelling, for instance, and there are others. Could that mean that some SMEs do not develop within the single market? Yes, of course. In very concrete terms, practical difficulties do arise. There's a gap between the legal situation and practices. There are shared rules, but then there are administrative practices which can be formidable and daunting for companies. In legal terms, it may look fine, but the day-to-day experience of businesses is very different. And this is why we need to highlight the existence of instruments like Solvit, and there are others. The Commission can also lodge a complaint if need be, because practices can be called into question, they can be attacked, even if that's not easy to do. Regarding harmonization, to go along with what has been said by others, when it comes to services, I mean, with goods, so there's a mutual recognition process, but for services, we're really just at the beginning. There's the Services Directive dating back to 2006, but there's no sector-by-sector approach, and that needs to be developed. This is something that the European Commission should perhaps do in the future, as it has the right to take initiatives. Auti Slotboom, a lot is being said about the greening of the economy, and this is recognized as vital. Is greening something that is slowing down the development of the single market? Are we going to have to choose between greening and the single market?
Just the opposite. Climate issues are the perfect example of where we all work more efficiently, where we work together. Greening the internal market and addressing climate change at the global level are issues where we should all put our forces together. We have EU rules under the heading of the Green Deal, and these create a level playing field for companies inside the EU. We have our green standards, which we can even export to the rest of the country. Some of our latest proposals, including the due diligence, seek also to involve what is imported and used from third countries into the internal market. It is essential to see greening and the single market together and join our forces. There are also inside the single market very good examples of network effects when, for example, where we move from more polluting vehicles to electric vehicles, we need charging stations everywhere, and to allow people to move, we need a common approach on how we build such networks, what standards we apply. And of course, coming back to what the EU is doing on top of regulation and standardization, in the RRF, the new generation EU budget, almost half of the money will be spent on greening the EU. And by joining our forces and building things together and financing our common priorities, we achieve much more than every country acting alone.
Merci beaucoup. Armgard Wippler?
Thank you very much. Armgard Wippler, would you like to come in on this one? I can only endorse everything that's just been said. And this opens up a whole range of tasks and topics for member countries, but also for the European Commission. And it's incumbent on all of us to work together. The current situation demonstrates that we're going to have to accelerate our efforts. We're going to have to really bring about a transformation in terms of greening and climate change. I think the current war has really shown us that we have to generate a new momentum. Thank you. Thank you. Francesco Martucci, greening of the economy. Do you think that this can be an obstacle for the development of the single market? No, quite the opposite. It's an opportunity. It's an objective for the European Union, of course, to protect the environment. Fighting climate change is one of the objectives, and we need to integrate all facets of the treaty, including the single market. It has to be seen as an opportunity, especially for SMEs that by definition pollute less than large firms. We can use Next Generation with its climate facet, targeting SMEs. I don't think it's an obstacle. As I say, on the contrary, it will help to promote development and innovation. Whole new markets are developing with SMEs, which are probably is best suited to offer solutions that meet the environmental concerns of our populations. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, we do have one. Is the single market compatible with local sourcing, which some consumers claim they want now, so to be able to consume local goods? Who would like to answer that question? Mr. Herrangs, does that speak to you? Yes, it does, yes. Think about health, what you're authorized to do in some countries or not. There are products that have to meet a certain local criteria. But I'd like to come back to something that was brought up a minute or two ago. What can change and be improved in the EU? Madame Gaudin talked about mirror clauses. Measures within the single market and outside, but I would like to focus on how they could apply within the single market. Nutritional prerogatives at national levels, so you may have a level of sugar consumption that's 10 in Germany and 5 in France. But you can import and export between those two countries, no barriers. There's a kind of unfair competition that arises there. Another thing is that at European level, there are very successful national initiatives, Nutri-Score in France, for instance, which has now been adopted by 6 countries in Europe. We can learn from other countries. Carrefour and Aldi are big retailers, are implementing them in many countries in Europe. And then you have networks of volunteers that promote contacts amongst entrepreneurs, the Entreprendre network in Belgium and France. And these are very successful too, because they bring together entrepreneurs from different sectors, and we often find solutions that we encounter on the single market by working together. Are there other questions?
Sometimes EU companies look straight to the big US market rather than to the market in neighbouring countries. How do we avoid that? Francesco Martucci, were you nodding there? Otis Ludman, perhaps?
Well, I believe that this is more a question to ask the companies, but of course, as the Commission, we are doing our best to make the EU an attractive investment target, and the EU is a very significant location for foreign direct investment also from third countries. So I don't think that we have done so badly. But maybe I could also come back to the previous question and say indeed that for climate reasons, among other things, it is important to look at the logistics chains and try to find environmentally friendly ways of consuming, including local consumption. At the same time, we are living in a world with global supply chains, and we will not reduce all our strategic dependencies on many issues, raw materials, some industrial components. The whole EU is currently importing from very few sources outside the EU, and in the broader context of looking at how to reduce our critical dependencies on individual third countries, we may also be thinking of diversifying our supplies.
Merci, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Let's have a look to see if we've got another question. Or anyone in the room. Does anyone wish to ask a question? Any questions to our panelists? The products and services markets is changing at Europe and global level. There are lots of innovations. How can you have a regulatory framework that is suited to that state of affairs?
Wie ich es auch eingangs sagte,
as I said at the beginning, the single market is not an area where we can sit back on our laurels and be happy with what we've achieved. It's a three-legged stool, if you like, and you have to keep looking at where we can improve, where we need to react. This issue, I think, touches on the question of financing, because innovation needs financing, and that's very often cross-border financing. There are an awful lot of activities in this area, and they're ever more important nowadays. Thank you very much. Juho Roma-Kaniemi, did you want to add something?
Interesting question and I come back to what I said earlier on, that the single market is never ready, and it's our tool to shape the world beyond our borders as well. You know, the EU nerds perhaps say that we just revisited services and digital and doing the capital markets, banking union, but we need to revisit them once again. You know, we need to regulate. The world is changing all the time, and we need to keep up. And we need to have the ambition to have the best legislative framework in the whole world. And regarding the environment, climate, and I would say sustainability in general, also on the social side as well, we have an excellent opportunity to actually set the global standards at the moment for that legislation, how the companies will act in the future in the global level. But there we need to be really smart that we don't overdo it, so that the other countries want to take this framework as well, and the companies want to apply them these globally as well, because you can combine the ambition to proportionality.
Merci beaucoup, Francesco.
Thank you very much. Francesco Martucci, would you like to add anything? Well, there are review clauses in European legislation and directives and what have you, so the Commission is supposed to regularly look again at its legal text. We don't want to have too much regulation. We talked about soft law as well, which is a more supple way of regulating, for example. There is a logistical issue here which might be a barrier for businesses, because businesses have to adapt to regulation, and regulation changing is an issue then. That creates costs and legal costs, which can sometimes be significant. Thank you very much to everybody. We'll have a quick break now, and in a couple of minutes we'll come back with the next part of the conference. See you in a second.
tous de nous rejoindre pour la deuxième.
Thank you very much for coming back to this second part of this morning's conference on the single market and SMEs. We're now going to hear from a number of speakers about life for SMEs in the single market. First of all, we'll hear from Tarek Krim, then Sarah Josephine Hjort, then Hani Sherry, Vincenzo Rendo, and then Yves Duchesne. Over to you.
Alors, Tariq Krim, on va commencer avec vous.
Tarek Krim, we're going to be talking to you. First of all, you are the founder of Polite and other websites. You talk about the infrastructure information, which has got to be an alternative to a startup nation. So could you perhaps tell us more about your concept of the Infor Nation? With the microphone would be better. Well, this is perhaps something which some of you will be discovering, but nearly all internet technology or web technology, the web was actually invented in Europe, whereas the internet was actually came from the USA. So we had Linux and MP3 Impact. All these technologies were invented in Europe, these web technologies. So we were able to develop a hybrid system, which was the first act on the web. The second act was the aggregation of these technologies by the larger companies based in the USA and in China. But I think that in Europe we have got all of the resources, and that's what I'm going to talk about, to actually develop the third act of the web era. Let me just go on to look at the slides with you. So, sorry, I thought I was going to be standing up, but I'll stay here where I am. But what is important, I think, to stress to you is that we've got to go back to the very building blocks. The internet technology was initially very positive, very humanist, and for the last couple of years we've said that that technology can actually be negative. And I think we've got to go back and look again at the internet and develop the internet that we will all love. So, what's important, and I think we've all understood this, is that for the last couple of months we've understood that we are entering a new world. We see the war in Ukraine, we have had the pandemic, we have seen the difficulties in supplies of raw materials, we've seen the energy crisis, the economic crisis, and many of you have seen as well that there is a technology crisis. Crypto technologies have crashed. We're seeing really a new era. And we have to think again about our digital strategy. When we talk about internet and we talk about the internet, there are three major threats. The first is what we would call a cyber war, which is the idea of hacking the infrastructures that we use. Over the last couple of years, we've also understood what the problem of the like war, which is the possibility of actually manipulating populations. And finally, and we've seen this in the last couple of weeks or over the last year, because I think that this can actually could have been relevant with what happened in Afghanistan, where in less than 24 hours, Google managed to deconnect Afghanistan. Or people have actually been able to be disconnected completely. And we can see that there is actually a fragmentation of the internet, which is called the splinternet these days. So, to a certain extent, Europe is caught between these geopolitical tensions. And on the other hand, there is this domination by the larger platforms. So it's an impossible equation, Europe plus big tech. Europe cannot be integrated into big tech. Big tech is all of the infrastructure that we do not control. We call this, or at least I call it, the domination stack. It's all of this technology which really is a tool for us in Europe. But we have got to use this type of technology. And sometimes we actually invented this technology, but it's actually been repackaged and sold back to us in Europe. So that's a problem because it creates a dependency. But it also poses the problem of social platforms which threaten our political model, but it's also important economically speaking because our economic capacity has now been limited by what we call the terms of services of the larger platforms. For example, when you want to use an application, you've got to pay 30% tax to Apple. If you're on the cloud, or if you are doing advertising or referring to things, if you're using the internet in this way, you will, in some manner, pay the platforms for the service. And these platforms use fiscal rules to make sure that there's actually no great benefit to our societies from using these platforms. Big tech has also been completely aligned with the US and US diplomacy. We realize that in Europe we haven't got control of these platforms at all. And sadly, in the situation that we're in, this actually limits the way in which we can do business abroad. If I develop an application for iPhone, for example, if Apple is not on the market that I want to be active on or decides to withdraw from that market, anything that I want to do with that platform or the equivalent Google platform will be cancelled. So there are limitations to using these platforms. Just to make this more specific, I was talking about the USA, but it is actually the same with China. In China, all of this new infrastructure which has been created, such as TikTok, which is the major competitor for Facebook, which is the main competitor to Facebook, and China is using this as a way of extending its zone of influence. When I was in Germany just last week, the term which is often used, and I use it less because I prefer to talk about the domination stack, but in Germany they talk about digital colonization, and we've got to try and move away from this. But how to do this? As I said, this domination stack means that on the one hand, we've actually made a few errors. We actually made our talent available to these platforms. We opened up our universities, artificial intelligence to them, and they had a competitive advantage. We weren't able to manage the fiscal side of things either. We've tried to do that, but we weren't able to break through in a certain way as well. There's another war. I mentioned wars, but in America they talk about lawfare. We have had diplomatic. We have had diplomatic advantages through, for example, the GDPR, and also with the DSM and the DMA. But we're now seeing that we're acting in an asymmetric system where American law is being applied to our industries when they're using the internet, and that's a problem for us. So there's this lack of symmetry. When we invest or when we actually give money to the companies, we're actually promoting American stock, and we're actually financing American pensions. When we finance companies in Europe, we're actually creating jobs and knowledge at local level. What's important, I think, is that we are able to emancipate from this domination stack. We've got to develop a new type of independence, digital and cognitive, because, of course, let's not forget that these tools really do shape the way in which we think. The good news is that there's an array of technology in Europe. Sadly, they're not well known, but the majority of companies working in this field are small companies. As you know, very often it's difficult for us to talk to these small companies, to reach them. Let's not forget that Google, before it became the giant that it is today, it was actually just 2 people in a garage. Apple, when it started out, were 2 people working in a garage. Amazon, the same. Facebook, a few people in Harvard, who were working together in a student residence. So we know how to develop a project, but we're not really sure how we can federate people to this idea, how we can enable people to work together to create our own stack. I've given you here an example of 100 different companies, because often people ask me, who are these companies that you mentioned? There are many of them in France, Germany, Austria, in many countries. In addition to that, there are many innovative startups which are working on specific areas of technology. As I said earlier, we have to remember that the first act of the web was set up was created in Europe, and so everything that we do that we're using on the internet has started up somewhere. Like Linux, for example, is the basis of the whole cloud computing, and with our mobile technology, we haven't actually really had much say in the developments. We've been users. We find these wonderful tools. That's why we took this on in Europe. Europe is one of the main markets for the larger platforms because it is the largest market. It's an area in the world where the networks are of very good quality, where we have high-speed communications, but we haven't been able to really introduce our values into this market, and that's a shame. But to some extent, we can do so, and I think that we in Europe should now be taking this opportunity to develop the new act of the digital world. We've had cloud computing, but now we're developing the slow web, for example, slow web design, which is involves edge computing, digital common open protocols. There are numerous projects in Europe where we're pulling things together so that we have an open protocol. Just let me remind you that email is an open protocol, which is free for you to all. But many of us are using Gmail or Outlook. But why shouldn't we invest in some of the 1,000 companies in Europe that are using these protocols and developing these protocols? Also, in Europe, a lot of companies are developing free software, and that's a real advantage in development terms. We also have got to ensure that we have interoperability and portability. That's also one of the strong points of our legislation, that we have a free flow of information so that we can actually develop the next stack of domination. We've got to be able to recuperate the information from big tech and actually create the new stack. And we've got to have a level playing field to do this. Another important point is that in the USA, the American cloud actually has benefited an awful lot from public procurement, from the state bodies and from the security bodies as well. We've got to be using this in the European field as well to support our industries. The next step is going to be that when we actually create our new stack, our new technologies, the startups that we create in Europe, rather than spending money using platforms of the old generation, we should be able to develop our new stack and develop a resilient and sovereign infrastructure which is in keeping with our values and which has got resilience for the future. The present model of the monopolies that we see do not give us many economic opportunities, but in a more open world, we do have a huge potential for new projects. We call this infrastructure, but really it's simply software. And to develop software, we need brilliant individuals, computers, and a lot of brain power. We are in a position to create all of that today in Europe. I think that Europe really should be the leader for this more human, more humanist internet, more climate friendly, because I think there's a lot that can be done to ensure that our digital consumption is much more green and consumes less energy. So just to conclude, as I said, I think that Europe now should be the author of the next chapter of the web development, and we can do this with our SMEs, with our technology, with the startups, with the large companies in Europe as well, and create a virtual environment. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tariq Karim. You talked about education, and that really is a great opportunity for us to move on to talk to Sarah Josephine Yort, who is the president and the founder of Canopy Lab. And you are going to be talking to us about the obstacles and the opportunities that rapid innovation presents, but also digital education. You talked about this a moment ago. We talked about that a minute ago, but we've got to look at this from a European context. Sarah, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for your presentation, Tarek. So I represent a digital education company that uses artificial intelligence to auto-generate course content based on content that already exists. And I want to sort of bring us to out there on the floor where people in SMEs in Denmark or the rest of Europe or the rest of the world are actually contemplating digitizing their content and providing reskilling and upskilling for their employees. When we don't win a client, we ask them, which competitor did you choose over us? And they tell us in 73% of cases, we didn't pick anybody. We're not digitizing now. It's too resource heavy. We don't really know how to start. We're gonna look at it again in 1 or 2 years. And we thought about what are we gonna do about that? And pre-pandemic, we decided to build this AI system that then can take the content that they already have and make it into engaging learning experiences and lowering the barrier for them to enter. And that was only possible, not because a single investor in Denmark or Europe, I'm talking private equity, wanted to do it, because they viewed it as high risk. And what was the likelihood that a woman from Denmark who had just started on a PhD in a technical field but was not from a technical field would be able to build that? One would assume the Americans had already built it if it was possible to build and for such a low investment. But we did get the money, and it was EU money from Industry 4.0 digitization boost that ran from 2017 to 22. And during that period, 61 SMEs in Denmark were awarded only 11 million euros, and actually some of us managed to radically transform our businesses and the lives of our clients. I have 5 points I'm going to stress. And I'll start by saying that if we believe that the pandemic accelerated the adoption of technology in SMEs, we are wrong. If we go accept what we call Zoom and Teams, etc. In fact, it has slowed down several projects, and we are in several projects, German companies that are supposed to roll out in China, and big national and international projects that have laid on a table for 1.5 years. So point number one, the competition is out there, and our competitors are moving faster than us. They're in the United States, they're in China, and we are not winning. And not winning matters. And it matters because, again, I will use an example from my world. When you build a digital education system, the software biases and how you construct that system, it influences how people learn and how people think. Do you want your kids to go to school in a software that was built by the Chinese, the Americans, or someone from Europe? It has a pedagogical model built into it. So the ability to win here from a software perspective and a content perspective is imperative. So the second part is about access to capital, and it has 2 parts. In general, there's not enough capital. There's not enough capital in Europe. There is more capital than there was before. It is still not enough. Third point, we need to see earmarked financing for women. So in Denmark, it is 1.5% of the venture capital that goes to teams consistent only of women, and 6.7% consistent of teams with male and female co-founders. That is a democratic problem. It is a problem that can only be solved at an EU level. It contains elements such as bias training. It contains that we have to look at venture capital firms, where we see today it's only 22% of venture capital firms in Europe that has a female partner. So these are huge problems that also translate into the companies that build software and build biases into software, not the kind of biases in education, but all kinds of other biases. And it's something we absolutely have to do something about right now. Fourth is access to talent. In Denmark, there's an acute lack of laborers in everything right now. So we have a problem with that, and we have a huge problem with the lack of investment in training of technical people within Europe. Not to be too political, but we do not have a track history in the last 10 years of being good at training AI developers. We cannot find AI developers within Europe, or in Vietnam, and other places, and it's a really, really big problem. And then when there's a lack of technical resources and there's a lack of laborers in general, maybe we need to, we've been so fast to include workers from the Ukraine, and that's been great, especially also both for them, but also because they are quite technically gifted. But there is talent on European soil that is not included in the economy because they don't have representation, and that is a problem. It is also a problem here in France that would be great to do something about. And finally, I do see some improvements around regulation. So when we have people from across Europe that come to work for us in our headquarters in Copenhagen, a lot of times, even though the laws are clear, it's hard for them to see what their rights are. And we have seen in the last 3 to 4 years, and not without influence from the EU, the Danish government have changed their systems, they have changed their formulas, they have changed regulation, and they have changed it so it's more transparent how to apply for certain rights and what your rights are. So that is a compliment I will pass on and give my time to the other speaker. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Hani Chéry, président et fondateur.
Hani Chéry, CEO and co-founder of T-Hive. You were Frank. Co-founder of this French startup, which has developed technology which helps to reduce production waste while guaranteeing quality. I should remind you that T-Hive has actually been also co-financed by 2 state bodies, and you're going to come back to talk to us about the ingredients that are required if we want to make sure that the material and software industries of Europe can be promoted, and things that will have an impact in the ecology and economy in a positive way at European level. You have the floor.
Thank you very much.
Really exciting to hear my colleagues just before, because it resonates so much with what I'm going to talk about. T-Hive, we have an ambition. We believe that the industries can do better. They can build better quality products, and at the same time, they can be more sustainable and greener. And that's why we are on a mission to build the best quality and raw material monitoring solutions. And what we learned in the last few years is that to reach such big, ambitious objectives, you really need to think holistically. What we call solution design. And just before coming here to Paris, so I'm coming from Grenoble, beautiful place, a little bit of pollution. I asked my team, why don't we, why can't we in Europe build this digital idyll? And the unanimous, the answer from all of my team members was the same. Look at us, we're building high-tech solutions, but we're using also technology platforms that are not European. So we use Microsoft, Amazon, Google, etc. And then the question that we asked was, why do we use these technologies? And to be very direct, it's because it's much easier to use and it's much more adapted to what we want. So Europe has exciting and excellent technologies. We just heard about the technologies, building blocks that we have, and that's actually, I think, that's the problem, because we think too much technology. So Europe is investing heavily on technology, and we need to keep investing on technology. But technology today, something that we learned is that technology is becoming a commodity. It's not technology that's going to help us improve climate change. It's the solutions that are going to use technology that are going to help us combat climate change. And therefore, if I would dig a little bit deeper into this, so going back to T-Hive, T-Hive, to tackle that big challenge, we said, okay, we are building solutions that are going to be easy to build, to integrate inside of production lines, can see inside of products at extremely high speeds. And to do that, we need to design our own chip, we need to design our own electronics, our own AI. We also need to build our own cloud platform, but we need to build easy-to-use user interfaces that are going to transform all of the data that we are analyzing in production line to the operators and the production line managers. And while doing this, we realized that accessing cash funding investment in Europe is extremely oriented on developing deep tech. So you are going to find quite a bit of money to do your technology part, but actually the deep tech, so if we talk about just a chip, I'll give you an example. Designing a chip requires tools that are way more expensive than the salaries that they are paying to a really highly skilled engineer. So, and then each engineer needs the same kind of cash. So it's really cash intensive, and we're talking only about the chip. So what happens is that you go into an investment round and you say, I need to make a chip. And you forget about the solution. You pitch the solution, but you're actually going to burn through all of your cash to make the chip. T-Hive is even more challenging because we're going to make the chip and the AI and the cloud and then trialing it with the users, etc. So if I just go a step back, our counterparts or our competitors outside of Europe, they easily get access to designing technologies and even get more money to design the solutions. And therefore, I believe that the way to get out of that, and maybe some of our policymakers that are around here, if we talk about the CHIPS Act, that's excellent, that's really good. What I'd like to say is that at least half of that money must go to SMEs. It shouldn't go only to big companies. So SMEs are way faster, and I'll give you an example. In 5 years, T-Hive designed 6 chips. When I talk to other counterparts in the industry, they say, but how did you do that? Well, we got access to funding from the EIC Accelerator, so we are an EIC Accelerator champion, so we've got equity and subventions from EIC Fund. We've got BPI France as well investing in T-Hive, quite some banks, but a lot of this money really was needed to actually be oriented towards the chip itself. It allowed us to accelerate, but I would say with the same amount of, let's say, if we can double that amount of money, we can go much, much faster. Because designing the chips, designing the AI, designing the cloud is going to be easier to do because innovation is rife, it's really everywhere all around us in Europe. It's really a terrain that is full of innovation. But we need at least double that money so that we can go around and understand the needs of the customer. So I just go back to our competitors, if we talk about competitors like Microsoft, etc. Look at this, at their solutions. Maybe when you go home, just look at the solutions that you're using. They are in each and every language. You can adapt it to the way that you operate. You feel that it's made to simplify your life. When you use it, you don't think of all the technology behind, but you just think of the simplicity that it brings to your life. So therefore, this is really the approach that we are taking. And I believe the main takeaway that we would bring here is that more investment, but really more investment that can think of technology as, unfortunately or fortunately, as a commodity for these SMEs, but also more investment really on helping all of these SMEs in accessing the market in a much faster way, increasing the adoption rates, and also why not? Why think only of the European terrain? We need to think global. So the same solutions that we're going to deploy here in Europe, it's already going to be very difficult because you're going to do it in so many languages, which is really cool, I think. Well, it's also very important as well to invest in translating into Chinese, to Japanese, to American English, to Spanish. Well, Spanish, we have Spanish, but we need to invest as well on translating our solutions, not only in language, but also in usage, to users that are outside of the European Commission. This is my verdict, and I give it back to you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much indeed, Hani Sheri. Vincenzo Renda from Digital Europe. You've gained experience working for industrial associations based in Brussels and also helping to deploy European funds, FEDER, in Germany. You say that digital skills are at the heart of the development of the single market.
Thank you very much for your introduction. It is great to be here, and indeed I praise the French presidency of the Council because of the importance of the single market and resilience for SMEs. So really glad to see this topic being discussed today. And indeed, I would like just to make my pitch, which is all about seeing digital skills as really an EU political priority, which I don't think is yet the case today. And we've heard from the technical experts in this field, so my intervention here will be more about the political dimension. But I would just like to say that, just very briefly, and I can see there the description of our association. We're the leading digital association at European level. We represent a total of 36,000 businesses, and those include a number of various segments that are very relevant for the European economy: manufacturing, health, financial services. These are all industries which really rely on the importance of digital skills. And in our membership, also want to highlight that we include both the providers of digital training solutions as well as the users. So this really gives us a comprehensive overview of what are the problems there today. And you will not be surprised that often digital skills tops their concerns. So where do we stand today? I think was mentioned before, COVID. We know that there are new opportunities where we can leverage the potential of hybrid learning, mixing in-person participation and remote learning. We also know that the European Commission is really promoting resilience. Before it was mentioned the example of semiconductors. Indeed, that's not just about expanding capacity, but it's also about developing capabilities in strategic segments of the supply chain, for example, design. But we're also aware of the importance of cyber resilience. So there are really drivers today that are urging a greater focus on digital skills at European level. So that should also be seen against the background of these digital decade targets by 2030. The member states agreed upon together with the European Commission. They're very ambitious. There's a target in terms of basic digital skills, 80% of the EU population with those skills by 2030. We're not, I can tell you that the progress there is really, really slow, and we must do more there. Our estimates tell us that we'll probably fall short of 15% at the current pace of investments and policies, and really the private sector is there to support, to do partnerships with the public sector to really make sure that we can meet this target and important political priority. The same goes for the number of ICT specialists by 2030. There's a target of 20 million of those. I think today we stand at around 9 million. So again, we're not yet halfway there. Let's make sure that we really can tackle this digital skills problem together. I think it's important to say no actor can really solve this digital skills gap alone. So I just want to highlight 3 priorities which I think are really important for public-private partnerships in this space. The first is cybersecurity. We know that Commission Vice President Vestager has launched this informal dialogue with member states across Europe. Let's make sure that cybersecurity is one of those priorities. Europe lacks today 200,000 cyber specialists. Obviously, the war in Ukraine may test the resilience of critical infrastructure in Europe. Again, that's an important topic. Second one, how we can better embed industry-led certification into the formal qualifications across Europe. It's often about just bridging for specific workers, just developing certain IT-specific competencies for a given application, for example. So how we can make sure that industry plays a role in supporting the public sector there. We as European Association are doing our role. We are now leading a European-wide project project called ESSA, which is about developing a software skills strategy for Europe. And the main purpose of this project is to identify the top 12 best practices on how to upskill for software competencies, and we'll be doing so thanks to the broad membership of the consortium that we are now leading. Another example, Women for IT. Women are underrepresented in the IT space, so again, together with the various sectors across Europe, we've led a project that led to, just in 2021, upskilling of 650 women. And today, I think 70% of those basically found a job in IT after 3 months. So again, we're trying to play our part, and we're ready to offer these examples in order to see them upskilled across Europe. And then a third area, and I think it has to be said, in the long term, obviously, it's absolutely crucial that we have coding in primary school and also foundational knowledge of computer science in secondary school. I think today we had a lot of interesting activities on how to strengthen the resilience of the single market for SMEs, but no investment, no initiative, though ambitious it may be, will be fully maximized unless we have the digital skills that are meant to support those. So again, these three priorities, they're all associated by the importance of public-private partnerships. Digital Europe, together with its members, is ready to support the public sector. Let's make sure that digital skills are really seen as a European priority. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Vincenzo Renda. Yves Duchesne, you're the founding president of AXEIS. You're an expert in cybersecurity. You have about 30 people working for you. The firm's based in Rennes, in Brittany. But you're not, you haven't got a foothold on the European market yet, and you're going to explain why. Are there codes you don't understand well? That's what you indicated. We're listening. Thank you very much. Indeed, I should perhaps explain a little bit what AXEIS is. So we offer lead cutting-edge expertise services for cybersecurity. We don't have any products. We just have expertise, about 30 people in Rennes, in Brittany, and we have certification by the French authorities. We are a significant player, even if we're still small, and probably our vocation is to become an international player quite soon. There are a number of issues I'd like to address. The presence outside Paris in a region. We operate on the national territory, but there's also the European market and the international markets, which are exciting prospects for us. But I really have to stress that the fact that we're outside Paris, the first hurdle we have is to get access to the Paris market and the national market, and that doesn't go without, can't be taken for granted. We have good expertise. We are offering innovative services. There are plenty of other firms like us, firms in Roubaix, for instance. To our level, we're working on a regional scale, and the first issue is to get access to the national market. At regional level, there are interesting initiatives to help people have access to the market. The Agency of Economic Development helps here, and the European Enterprise Network, which provide advice and support to help understand how to access the European market. But what has held us back a little bit is not lack of information, but the rather complicated procedures or our perception of those procedures. I don't know if they're really cumbersome and difficult, but that's our perception at any case, at any rate. And there's a kind of cultural hurdle to get access to the European market. For a small player, SME with a staff of 30, the prospect of taking on the European market or signing up for European projects would imply a lot of cumbersome procedures that we feel are rather intimidating. and might be difficult to cope with. That's our impression. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point is that there's a specificity where we don't quite fit with the standard model of startups. These are companies that have an innovation, an innovative view, but we just provide services. Our strength is services, technical expertise in cybersecurity, audits, that kind of thing. So we're not promoting an innovation. We don't have a product as such. And what we see with the many tools and that exist to access the European market or the national market even, tend to be suited to products, innovative products, but not to services. Our ambition is to offer a high-quality, cutting-edge service, and those instruments aren't really suited to our template. It seems to me there's a gap there. Disseminating a security culture, a cybersecurity culture, is a huge stake at national and European level. There are many others, but still. And if that's our objective, then you need to define something that would help service industries, which are the cornerstones. If you want to secure, you need products, of course, but you need to help people to adopt good practices. You need to identify issues to avoid and to navigate your way through cybersecurity. So I think it would be a good idea to think of various support devices to help services, help us as service businesses to grow and to venture out into the European market. The European market is welcoming us with wide open arms in a way. There's French-German cooperation, BNC, for instance, and ANSSI. ANSSI is working on this. We have certification, qualification. It's a driver for cybersecurity in Europe. And there's all the work that's been done at European level, relatively easy transposition of French models to European level. There's a directive that's virtually ready now. And this means that we would benefit the transposition of national models to the European level. So all of that exists and should help us to get into the European market. But still, the real problem we have is this cultural problem, because seen from my point of view in Rennes, in Brittany, it all looks really difficult to cope with, very cumbersome. When we set up the company, we wanted to focus on cutting-edge expertise, and right from the start, we thought that we were going to have a very heavyweight, awkward procedures if we wanted to ramp up to Europe. Investment, of course, is required, but also deadlines. Often it takes a very long time to go through all these procedures, and we're very nimble, we're very agile. We are funded through our income, so people paying for our services. So our time horizon is not a 2 to 3 year time horizon. We need to get sales and have quick turnover. And often the support mechanisms are kind of based on funding. But for us, that's not the issue in services. We don't have an innovation that needs developing with R&D and the like. The real levers for us are not financial in nature. We need a computer, a brain, a chair, and a bit of time, and then we can provide a service. It's not like a product startup, and maybe something needs to be reconsidered at that level.
Thank you very much, Yves Duchesne. Hanny Sherry is also from Grenoble, so you can have international cooperation with businesses in the same region. Thank you to all of you for your statements. I suggest that we break for lunch quickly now and that we come back at 2 p.m. For those of you who are actually here in Bercy, I would ask you or invite you to the buffet on the ground floor, and then we'll all be back here at 2 p.m. for the second part of the conference on SMEs and the single market. See you in a moment.